quiet. You're just an interpreter. What could you possibly know?" The harsh voice of a male delegate echoed through the VIP cabin. The diplomatic aircraft shook violently, red warning lights flashing continuously. Outside the windows, 2 F-22s closed in, weapons systems armed. Elena gripped her silver necklace, pressing a hidden button inside the pendant. The intercom crackled with encoded transmission. "Falcon 214, Alpha Red. Cancel fire order immediately." The F-22 cockpit went silent. Alpha Red? Only one person in the world was ever given that code. The cabin fell silent, all eyes turning to the woman they had just ridiculed. Elena Carter, 32 years old with long brown hair pulled back in a neat bun, deep, intelligent eyes, wore an immaculate white business suit that conveyed diplomatic professionalism and understated authority. As she entered the VIP cabin of the commercial aircraft reserved for the diplomatic delegation, many passengers' glances swept over her. Assuming she was merely administrative staff accompanying the official party, an older male delegate burst into dismissive laughter. "Interpreters get VIP seating now? This section is reserved for officials, not secretaries with typing skills." Several women in the delegation exchanged knowing looks, smiling coldly while whispering among themselves, "These days, anyone can push their way into first-class seating." The flight attendant looked confused, suggesting they double-check seat assignments. Elena calmly presented her diplomatic credentials, bearing official government seals and clearances. Without argument or protest, she quietly took her assigned seat, opened her briefcase, and began preparing bilingual documents for translation work during the flight. A senior administrative officer, a former military man seated nearby, observed Elena's demeanor carefully, whispering to his colleague, "Don't be too quick to dismiss her. Sometimes the people who seem smallest are the ones keeping this entire journey safe." Elena didn't respond to the contemptuous remarks, simply smoothed her white suit jacket, her eyes gazing out the window where storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. The dismissive comments continued throughout the boarding process, with several delegates making jokes about translators playing dress-up and secretaries who think they belong with real diplomats. Elena maintained her composure with quiet dignity, her training having taught her that actions spoke louder than words, and that the right moment to prove herself would come when circumstances demanded it. Her fingers occasionally touched the silver necklace at her throat, a gesture that seemed both protective and meaningful. The pendant appeared to be simple jewelry, but closer inspection would have revealed precision engineering that suggested far more than decorative purpose. The senior administrative officer continued watching Elena with growing curiosity. Something about her bearing, the way she processed information, the methodical precision of her document preparation, reminded him of military personnel he had encountered during his own service years. As the aircraft prepared for takeoff, conversations turned to other diplomatic matters, and Elena seemed to blend into the background of routine international travel. But her alert awareness never relaxed, her training keeping her constantly aware of potential threats and changing conditions. The weather outside was deteriorating, with reports of unusual atmospheric disturbances that could affect their flight path. Most passengers paid little attention to these routine updates, but Elena processed each piece of information with tactical precision. Her diplomatic credentials were genuine, but they represented only a small portion of her actual qualifications and clearances. The woman being dismissed as just an interpreter carried authority that reached into classified levels of military and intelligence operations. The mockery from other delegates stung. not because she needed their validation, but because it reminded her of the challenges she had faced throughout her career. Being underestimated because of her appearance and assumed role was nothing new, but it never became easier to endure. She opened her laptop and began working on translation protocols, but her screen also displayed encrypted communication channels and security briefings that would have surprised anyone observing closely enough to notice. Outside the aircraft windows, the sky was darkening with more than just weather, and Elena's trained instincts were beginning to detect signs that this diplomatic flight might become something far more dangerous than routine international travel. Her quiet vigilance was about to prove invaluable in ways that none of the dismissive delegates could have imagined. The senior administrative officer wrote in his personal journal after the trip, "In that moment, I saw in her the kind of discipline that doesn't belong to ordinary people. A calmness that only experienced soldiers possess." The aircraft entered turbulent airspace as reports came through the radio about suspected terrorist infiltration in the region. The diplomatic flight had unknowingly entered a zone where hostile forces were operating with sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities. The cabin systems began experiencing severe interference, with navigation and communication equipment showing signs of external manipulation. Passengers throughout the VIP section began expressing alarm as the aircraft shuddered more violently than normal atmospheric conditions would cause. Several delegation members started voicing suspicions, their fear expressing itself through paranoid accusations. How do we know the interpreter isn't involved? Why else would they put a translator on this particular flight? Elena remained silent, her eyes showing increased alertness, but no defensive responses to the growing hostility directed toward her. The accusations were baseless, but fear often made people search for scapegoats among those they already distrusted. The same delegate who had initially mocked her credentials stood up and pointed accusingly, "I told you from the beginning, we shouldn't have brought outsiders into this cabin. She could be anyone." Emergency alarms began sounding throughout the aircraft, creating an atmosphere of chaos and panic, as passengers realized their diplomatic immunity wouldn't protect them from whatever was developing outside. 2 F-22 fighter jets appeared alongside their aircraft, signaling for emergency descent and course correction. The military pilots were following protocols designed to intercept potentially compromised civilian aircraft, regardless of diplomatic status. Several delegates panicked completely. "They're going to shoot us down! We're going to die because of security failures!" Elena gripped her silver necklace tighter, her eyes blazing with intensity while maintaining outward calm. Years of training had prepared her for exactly this type of crisis, though she had hoped never to need those skills in civilian life. The senior administrative officer noticed her gesture and frowned slightly, recognizing that what appeared to be simple jewelry was actually something far more sophisticated. The precision of its construction suggested military-grade equipment rather than decorative accessories. A flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom with barely controlled panic. "Please remain calm. We are awaiting further instructions from air traffic control." Elena quietly leaned forward, pressing a small activation point on her pendant's surface. A hidden microphone immediately came online, connecting her directly to classified military communication frequencies. Her encoded transmission cut through standard radio protocols. Falcon 214. Alpha Red requesting immediate priority override. The F-22 pilots immediately ceased their intercept procedures, their voices filled with shock and disbelief. That authentication code, only one person was ever authorized to use it. The cabin fell into stunned silence as every passenger realized that the woman they had been dismissing and accusing had just demonstrated capabilities that reached into the highest levels of military command structure. The transformation in atmosphere was immediate and complete. Delegates who had been mocking her secretary status were now staring in amazement, finally understanding that Elena's true qualifications extended far beyond translation services. Through the aircraft's communication system, military control centers were rapidly verifying the authentication codes Elena had transmitted. Computer systems across multiple command levels were confirming her identity and clearance levels. The F-22 flight leader's voice came through with obvious emotion. "Falcon 214, you're the pilot who saved my life at Miramar when my systems failed during training. I never thought I'd hear that call sign again." His personal testimony broadcast across military frequencies, providing confirmation that went beyond technical authentication. The legend of Falcon 214 had been dormant, but it was unmistakably active again. Within the diplomatic cabin, passengers were beginning to comprehend that they had been traveling alongside someone whose military record was classified at levels they couldn't access. The interpreter they had ridiculed was clearly a figure of significant importance in military aviation circles. Elena continued coordinating with military control, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding respect from elite fighter pilots. Maintain protective formation. Do not allow hostile forces to compromise this flight path. The F-22s immediately shifted into escort positions. Their previous intercept mission transformed into protective duty for someone whose clearance levels superseded normal diplomatic protocols. Security experts rushed to the cockpit, discovering evidence of sophisticated electronic intrusion into the aircraft's navigation systems. Terrorist forces had indeed been attempting to hijack the diplomatic flight remotely, using capabilities that could have resulted in tragedy. Elena's timely intervention had not only prevented military engagement of their aircraft, but had also triggered security protocols that neutralized the electronic warfare attack. Her authentication had shifted their status from potential threat to protected asset. The delegate who had been most vocal in his accusations now sat hunched in his seat, his face pale with the realization that his paranoid suspicions had been directed at the one person capable of ensuring their survival. Elena removed her silver pendant and placed it on the table. The metal surface clearly engraved with Falcon 214 in military specification lettering. The evidence was undeniable. The woman they had dismissed was a legendary figure whose military record had been classified for reasons of national security. The cabin remained in shocked silence as passengers processed the magnitude of their error in judgment. The quiet professional they had treated as an outsider was clearly someone whose capabilities commanded instant recognition and respect throughout the military aviation community. Outside the aircraft, the F-22 escort maintained perfect formation, a visible reminder that Elena's intervention had transformed a potential disaster into a protected diplomatic mission. The F-22 flight leader immediately contacted military command with obvious amazement. Falcon 214 has returned to active status, requesting confirmation of all protocols. Command headquarters fell silent for several seconds, then rapidly switched to emergency priority channels. All units maintain positions. No interference with civilian aircraft. Falcon 214 has operational authority. The delegate who had spent the flight mocking Elena turned ashen, collapsing back into his seat as the full magnitude of his error became clear. His earlier arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced by the dawning realization that he had been attacking a military legend. One of the F-22 pilots transmitted over general frequencies, his voice filled with emotion. "Falcon 214, you're the instructor who saved my life At Miramar, when my systems failed during advanced training, I never expected to fly escort for you as a civilian. The personal testimony spread across military communication networks, with pilots and controllers throughout the region recognizing that they were witnessing the return of someone whose training methods and tactical expertise had influenced an entire generation of military aviators. Within the diplomatic cabin, delegates sat in stunned silence as they realized the woman they had dismissed as just an interpreter was actually a classified military asset whose identity had been protected at the highest levels of government security. Elena remained seated calmly, adjusting her communication equipment with practiced precision. Maintain protective formation around diplomatic aircraft. Do not allow hostile electronic interference to compromise our flight path. The F-22 pilots immediately executed her tactical instructions, their formation shifting into optimal defensive positions that demonstrated both their respect for her authority and their confidence in her strategic judgment. A cybersecurity specialist who had been monitoring the aircraft's systems rushed to the cockpit with alarming discoveries. The diplomatic flight had been under sophisticated electronic attack from hostile forces attempting to remotely hijack their navigation and communication systems. Elena's timely authentication had triggered military countermeasures that neutralized the cyber warfare attack. Switching their aircraft to protected status with encrypted communication channels that hostile forces couldn't penetrate. The delegates who had been so quick to accuse Elena of suspicious behavior now understood that her presence had actually prevented what could have been a catastrophic terrorist operation against their diplomatic mission. Elena carefully removed her silver pendant and placed it on the conference table. The engraved military designation Falcon 214, clearly visible to everyone in the VIP cabin. The physical evidence confirmed what the radio transmissions had already proven. She was indeed the legendary pilot whose classified record had shaped modern military aviation training. The cabin atmosphere had transformed completely, from dismissive mockery to respectful silence, as passengers processed the reality that they had been traveling with someone whose capabilities extended far beyond civilian diplomatic work. Military historians would later note that certain call signs carried authority that transcended retirement and civilian status, and that Falcon 214 represented operational excellence that commanders trusted implicitly, regardless of current assignment. The delegate who had been most vocal in his criticism now sat speechless, his hands trembling as he realized that his paranoid accusations had been directed at the one person whose intervention had saved all their lives. Elena's coordination with military forces continued with calm professionalism. Request priority escort to destination. Diplomatic mission must continue as scheduled. All security protocols now active. The response from military command was immediate and comprehensive. Falcon 214. Full military assets at your disposal. Diplomatic protection. Protocols engaged. Safe passage guaranteed. Throughout the aircraft, passengers were witnessing something extraordinary. A civilian who could command instant respect and immediate cooperation from the most elite military units in the world. The F-22 pilots maintained perfect escort formation while broadcasting their amazement to other military units in the region. Flying Escort 4, Falcon 214. Never thought we'd have this honor. Her training saved more pilots than anyone will ever know. Elena's reputation within military aviation circles had always been legendary, but most personnel had assumed her service record was historical rather than active. Her demonstration of current operational authority proved that certain capabilities never truly retired. The senior administrative officer who had recognized something special about Elena from the beginning nodded with deep satisfaction. his military instincts completely vindicated by the dramatic revelation. Elena methodically restored her equipment and returned her pendant to its place around her neck. The transition back to civilian appearance seamless, despite having just coordinated a military operation that prevented international incident. The other delegates remained silent, their earlier confidence in their own importance completely shattered by witnessing someone whose real authority exceeded anything they could access through normal diplomatic channels. Through the aircraft's windows, passengers could see the F-22 escorts maintaining protective distance, a visible reminder that the quiet woman in the white business suit had just demonstrated capabilities that commanded respect from the world's most advanced military technology. Radio confirmations continued flowing from various military units. Falcon 214. Authentication verified. Protection protocols active. Honored to provide escort services. The transformation extended beyond just respect for Elena personally. It represented a fundamental lesson about assumptions and the danger of judging people based on superficial roles rather than actual capabilities. Elena's handling of the crisis had been flawless, demonstrating tactical awareness, technical expertise, and command presence that would be studied in military academies for years to come. The delegate who had initiated the mockery finally found his voice, but only to whisper a barely audible apology that reflected his complete humiliation at having attacked someone whose service record was classified at levels he couldn't access. As the aircraft continued toward its destination under military escort, passengers began to understand that they had witnessed something historic. The return of a military legend who had chosen civilian service, but retained the capabilities that had made her famous throughout the aviation community. Elena's quiet professionalism throughout the crisis had prevented not only their deaths, but also what could have been a significant international incident involving terrorist attacks on diplomatic missions. The silver pendant rested against her white suit, no longer appearing to be simple jewelry, but clearly representing authority and responsibility that transcended normal civilian status. The crisis was over, but the lesson about assumptions and hidden capabilities would remain with every passenger for the rest of their lives. The aircraft landed safely with full F-22 escort, military security teams waiting on the tarmac to ensure the diplomatic delegation's safe arrival. The electronic warfare attack that could have resulted in tragedy had been completely neutralized through Elena's intervention. As passengers prepared to disembark, the atmosphere in the VIP cabin had fundamentally changed. No one dared to look at Elena with the dismissive attitudes they had displayed during boarding, and several delegates approached with obvious embarrassment and genuine gratitude. The senior administrative officer looked at Elena with newfound respect, nodding acknowledgement. "I knew there was something special about you from the beginning. My instincts were correct." Other delegation members remained silent, their earlier confidence in their own importance completely humbled by witnessing someone whose actual authority exceeded their diplomatic credentials by orders of magnitude. Over the aircraft's radio system, the F-22 flight leader made his final transmission. "Falcon 214. Today you didn't just save this aircraft. You reminded all of us what true loyalty and service look like." Elena didn't respond verbally, simply adjusting her white suit jacket and gazing thoughtfully out the window, as if the entire crisis had been routine rather than life-threatening. When the delegation finally disembarked, Elena walked behind the group rather than with them, maintaining her civilian role despite having just demonstrated capabilities that commanded respect from military forces around the world. The delegate who had spent the flight ridiculing her approached hesitantly, his face red with shame. I owe you an apology. I was completely wrong about everything." Elena glanced at him briefly, but said nothing. Her silence more powerful than any verbal response could have been. Her focus remained on completing the diplomatic mission rather than extracting revenge for earlier insults. Airport security and military personnel maintained respectful distance, understanding that Elena's civilian status required careful handling despite her demonstrated military connections and operational authority. The transformation in how people viewed Elena extended beyond just the immediate delegation. Word was already spreading through diplomatic and military circles about the incident that had revealed a legendary pilot operating in civilian disguise. Social media posts from other passengers began appearing, though most were careful not to reveal specific details about Elena's military background or the nature of the crisis that had been averted. Parents who had witnessed the event began using it to teach their children about respect and the importance of not judging people based on their apparent roles or social positions. Military personnel at the airport spoke in hushed tones about the Falcon 214 incident, understanding that they had witnessed the emergence of a legend that many had assumed was historical rather than active. Flight crews throughout the aviation community began sharing the story, recognizing that they had been part of something extraordinary that demonstrated how hidden capabilities could prevent international disasters. The delegates who had initially dismissed Elena as unimportant began questioning their own assumptions about the people around them, wondering what other hidden expertise they might have overlooked in their professional lives. Elena's handling of both the crisis and its aftermath had demonstrated the same quiet professionalism that had made her legendary within military circles, focused on results rather than recognition, outcomes rather than personal vindication. As the diplomatic mission continued, Elena returned to her role as interpreter and translator, but everyone now understood that her presence represented far more than linguistic support. The silver pendant remained visible at her throat, no longer appearing to be simple jewelry, but clearly representing authority and responsibility that transcended normal civilian credentials. Her quiet competence had saved lives, prevented international incident, and provided a powerful lesson about assumptions and the value of treating everyone with respect, regardless of their apparent status. Several weeks later, a handwritten letter arrived at Elena's diplomatic office address. The sender was the F-22 pilot, whose life she had saved during training at Miramar years earlier. The same pilot who had provided escort during the diplomatic crisis. Inside the envelope, he had written, "If possible, I hope you'll teach me again, not about flying techniques, but about the kind of calm courage and leadership that no classroom can provide, the qualities that make legends out of ordinary people." Accompanying the letter was a photograph of his F-22 with handwritten inscription, "Falcon's Heir." The tribute represented recognition from a new generation of pilots who understood that Elena's influence extended far beyond her direct service record. Elena held the letter silently for a long time, her eyes showing the first hint of emotion she had displayed since the entire incident began. The respect of fellow military personnel meant more to her than any civilian recognition could provide. The senior administrative officer happened to observe her reading the letter, nodding with understanding. He found the right teacher, didn't he? Elena simply smiled slightly and carefully filed the letter with other professional correspondence, treating the heartfelt tribute as routine business, despite its obvious personal significance. Military academies quietly began incorporating the diplomatic flight incident into their case studies, demonstrating how individual expertise and proper authentication could prevent international crises and loss of life. The delegate who had spent the flight ridiculing Elena found that the experience had changed his entire approach to professional relationships, making him more humble and respectful in his interactions with support staff and civilian contractors. Other diplomatic personnel who heard the story began paying closer attention to the backgrounds and qualifications of people they worked with, understanding that expertise often came in unexpected packages. Elena returned to her regular duties as diplomatic interpreter and translator, working with international delegations who had no idea that the quiet professional helping with their communication had once been one of the most respected pilot instructors in military history. Her white business suits became her uniform in civilian service, projecting the same professionalism and competence that her military uniform had represented during her active duty years. The silver pendant remained her only visible connection to her military past, a reminder of capabilities and responsibilities that continued to serve even in civilian life. Sometimes, while working late at her diplomatic office, Elena would hear military aircraft passing overhead and remember that somewhere in the sky, pilots she had trained were still serving, still protecting people who would never know their names. Elena walked to her office window, her white suit reflecting the afternoon sunlight, the old silver pendant resting quietly in her hand, a symbol of living legend who preferred quiet service to public recognition. Never dismiss the quiet ones, because sometimes they are the people writing the safety and future of everyone around them, carrying legacies that can save lives when crisis comes. If you believe in stories that touch the heart like this one, leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe to SN Quiet Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten. Real people are creating and telling stories, not mass-produced AI